and welcome along to the Open Newsroom here at the Journal. Thank you all very much for being here with us today. My name is Christine Bowen and I work here at the Journal. And when I say here, I obviously mean that figuratively rather than literally, because like so many people, all of us at the Journal have been working from home for the past 13 months, almost 14 months now at this stage. Hopefully you will have seen some of the work that we've been doing as part of the Good Information Project at the Journal, which is a big new project that we're working on where every month we tackle one big topic and try to answer the questions that readers have about it. So last month we looked at what life on a shared island of Ireland could look like. This month we're looking at what work could look like after COVID. So we're going to try and find out what questions you want answered and hopefully dig some facts up and equip you with the skills to seek out good information about it. So if we're talking about work after COVID, we're first of all looking at kind of the problems that there are, like what needs to be fixed, what's broken about work at the moment. We're looking at what the possible solutions are, and also whether they're coming from employers or employees whose interests are these solutions acting in, or where are these solutions coming from. And I think the biggest thing we're looking at is about how realistic is it that things will actually change once we're through a pandemic, once we come through COVID, come out the other side. How different will work actually look like? What solutions will actually be in place and what changes will happen? So to bash these topics out, I'm joined by my colleagues Sean Murray and Adam Daly for the next about 30 minutes or so to talk about these things and about how we're covering them in the newsroom. Sean and Adam have been leading the charge for us in covering these for the Journal, so I'm really glad to have them both here today. Hi Sean, hi Adam.
Hey guys.
Hi. And I feel before we start into the questions, I think we can't really talk about working from home or the future of work without being a little bit reflexive and talking about your own situations. So, and where you're working from. So maybe let's just start with that, Sean and Adam. Sean, people watching might be interested in your setup. So do you want to talk us through where you are and where you've been working from?
So I've been quite lucky. Around the start of the pandemic, I moved home to my parents' house, and I'm currently in my parents' shed here. It's a really, really nice space. I feel really lucky to have it because I know that a lot of my colleagues and other people I know who are working from home aren't in such a similar situation. But it's really great. I have a table here. I have a screen. I have a second screen. I have a Wi-Fi booster as well that allows me to do Zoom calls and things like that. So it's a really nice space. It's really nice it's like a physical act of leaving the house, even if it's to walk down your garden to go into the shed to come to work.
Which is much needed. Adam, what about you? Where are you working from?
Well, I suppose I've changed mid-pandemic. I was with my parents for the first half, and then myself and my girlfriend moved in together back in October. And then one thing I suppose that came up when we were looking for a place to live is to have the space to work, because we're both working remotely. So that's something that obviously a lot of people have to factor in now when you're looking for a place to live, is that you're also have to accommodate your own, I suppose, office if that's the line of work that you're in. So we're lucky in a sense that the place that we got, I suppose, has a space that we can work, but with the two of us, obviously the space has to be divided up. So I'm luckier than most, I suppose, so I can't complain, but it's definitely, I suppose I went back in October, we found this place, and it was, I suppose, between lockdowns. So we were lucky enough to be able to view the place, and although a lot of places we were going off pictures and stuff like that, but for people that are looking to rent or to buy now, I don't envy the position that they'd be in, just based on the fact that you can't go to viewings really. So you're kind of shot in the dark really to find a place that you like, and then the other caveat of having to find a place that has I suppose, office built in nearly.
Yeah, I'm working from my dining room table, so I 100% understand where you're coming from with that sense of, are the places we live built in order, suitable for us to be able to work from home in the way that many of us are likely to be in the future. So let's kind of start with that and jump right in with that. Sean, can we start with what do we know about when it's likely that we might actually see office workers returning to their offices? Because I've seen, particularly in the US, I've seen offices and companies start giving dates for when people can expect to come back in, and often it's predicated on, or it's linked to vaccination rates in particular states or across the country. But what do we know about Ireland? Like, when are we likely to see a return?
Unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of things to do with vaccination rates and the progress of the disease here, we really don't have an answer for sure. Last week at the NEFIT briefing, one of our reporters, Gráinne Ní, she asked Dr. Ronan Glynn, when is it that we will even consider a return to offices? And while he didn't quite say that the limit on going to the office will be the last restriction to be lifted, he did kind of signal that it will still be some time. Like, we know the priorities for reopening society from the government are, it was schools and construction. Next, it will be probably non-essential retail and hairdressers and personal services like that. And then we're looking at hospitality then after that, and then offices are even way beyond that again. So, like, we know Taoiseach Lee Varadkar last week hinted that vaccinations could be the main driver on advice on returning to the office. And let's not make this about vaccinations. We hear enough about them. We know the problems there. So we don't know when we'll get to that point. And Varadkar, he was stressing last week that we're not at that point yet. And what Dr. Glynn said as well at that NEFRA briefing was that we'll get through to June. We'll have a look at the progress of the disease, and we will probably look at it again in July on the return to offices. And I know it was being reported this morning in places that it could be September. But again, it all depends on variants, on vaccines, and all those names that we wish we don't have to hear about again going forward. So I think an important point to point out is that when we are permitted to return to the office, will we actually want to? Will large swathes of the workforce want to? And I think it's something we might return to again throughout the chat, that I think there will be an expectation among a lot of traditionally office-based employees to keep this what we're doing now in some form after this. Like, if you've been working from home for 12 months, it's important to say that if you've been working to a high standard and you've been able to complete your work, then you have a tangible case to say, I can keep doing this in some form afterwards. And I think a lot of it could be union driven. A lot of it could be engagement with individual employers. So that's going to be an important aspect going forward. And as well, we have government initiatives like the legislating for the right to request homework and the right to disconnect. And they could also be very important in this context. You're muted, Christine. You'll have to come back to us.
Oh no, that's actually more spying. I can't believe I did the cardinal sin of working from home. I forgot to unmute myself. I was just, more spying. I was going to say thanks to everybody who's joined us in the last couple of minutes there. We're talking about the future of work as part of the Good Information Project here at the Journal. And I'm going to turn to my colleague Adam and say, Adam, do we know what people actually want? Because in terms of working from home in the future, because we're talking about this as, getting a sense of when it will actually happen. But do we know whether or not is there a consensus on whether people are happier working from home or whether they prefer to work in the office, if that is an option available to them?
I think consensus on the issue would be kind of hard to quantify. But we could go off the surveys that have been issued on the subject, but we have to obviously put a health warning on those, because there's usually a recruitment company behind those surveys, or whoever the company is behind them generally has some sort of vested interest in the issue. But from what they're saying, we can probably work out that a majority of people are happy with their work from home setup in some form or another. But we would like, I suppose, there is a cohort of people that obviously want to get back to the office, but it's very hard to define, or I suppose it's hard to be definitive on the issue. But I suppose that's kind of the need why we need a flexible approach to working from home in the future, because it's such a mixed bag, and not one industry that's been affected will want the same solution. So it's very much, I suppose Sean will touch on it later on, what the government are doing on it, but definitely the flexible approach is the way to go, just because we have no definitive idea of the number of people who want a certain thing.
Yeah, it feels like for years employees have been the ones who've been told to be flexible in terms of our approach to work, and now suddenly the onus is on employers needing to be the ones to be flexible, which is such a big change in the way that we're used to capitalism and to working in recent decades. Sean, what are companies actually doing to prepare for this? Because it is such a huge change for them. Like, how do we know, what kind of things have you seen that companies are doing to get themselves ready for this kind of shift in work or potential shift in work?
Yeah, I think Adam touched on it there. It's very much dependent on the individual sector that you work in, and then also the individual employer. There could be one employer in a sector says, okay, there's going to be a large scale move to remote working, but then the rest of the employers in that sector might say no. Anecdotally, we've heard firms in finance, maybe accounting, solicitors, they might be itching to get back a little more in those sectors, but it might not always be the case. Some some companies have led the charge. They're already signaling the way they're going to go. And we've seen last month that Liberty Insurance, they said that they were going to move to a primarily remote workforce in the future, which is obviously a massive shift for them from a traditionally office-based. We've seen Revolut, the financial firm, they're saying that they're going to give employees the option of that blended work we keep hearing about, where you can do some days in the office, some days at home, mixture of the two. Microsoft, another huge company who said that they're offering full-time or blended working. One of the things that does come into it, though, is just the sheer amount of uncertainty. Like we've been at home because it's the public health advice for like over 400 days now. It's the public health advice: if you can work from home, stay at home. We don't know what that public health advice will be when it changes. It could be office capacity at 50%. It could be at 75%. We don't know that for sure. So it will be definitely on employers to be flexible. Now, I know HR departments will probably right now be working on, okay, what will it look like in the future when hopefully if when these restrictions do lift, they're working on that. Like companies were literally flung into this at the start. They had to quickly adapt and change, like in large ways, about how they worked. They have a little bit more time now. They have a little bit more time to kind of look ahead to see what suits them, what suits their employees. Because as I said, there's going to be, I'd say in a lot of sectors, and a lot of people are going to be demanding that kind of flexible work. I've proven I can work from home, so I want that option kind of thing. I think we'll see that a lot more in the future, and companies are having to kind of factor that in and make sure their plans kind of suit as many of their employees as possible.
I'm interested in what you said there and about whether this comes down to whether it's coming from employers or employees. Like, is this kind of, in some ways you can think of employees being the ones who want the kind of work-life balance, or to be able to try for a work-life balance at the very least by having more time at home? Or is it employers kind of pushing this idea of having to pay less rent, say in expensive places, or less overheads for employees, all being in one central place? Like, do you think this is coming from employers or employees?
I think it's definitely a mixture of the two, because like there's a few of the companies I mentioned there earlier on, they've already kind of set out their stall, but they're not, like, I'd say the large majority of the companies haven't actually set out their stall yet. So they're trying to like base it on their business needs and how it can work in future. Like it could be a specific employer who's paying a lot of rent on a premises in Dublin City. They've seen how well it can work for their employees to be at home, and if their employees are also happy to do that, then that would be the specific decision for that company. And I think maybe in some areas like the public sector, Forza, the trade union there, has written to the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform and kind of said, we need a policy on remote working in the public sector. They're kind of demanding it. So it could be like, it is union-led in some areas and it's employer-led in some areas, and it's where that two meet, which I think will be for the majority of workers, I think, about whether or not what form they go back to the office.
We got a comment from Fidelma who says, we seriously need the government to introduce a working from home allowance and increase the rate of tax relief on utilities and broadband, as what they're currently offering is a pittance. And Adam, I suppose, we're talking about whether this is on employers, employees, the government, who obviously also have a role too. But what kind of practical things are we talking about that would make this workable, would make this practical for people to be able to do remote work in the future?
I suppose one of the main things that is in the government's plan to, I suppose, change the working culture that we currently have, maybe with the issues that are in that, but is the right to switch off, which it's when you say right, it's a code of conduct, and there's 3 separate rights that are enshrined in that code of conduct. And the idea would be, and it was drawn up by the Workplace Relations Commission, and the idea is that employees and employers will work out a policy that suits their company, but it has to, basically there's 3 rights that have to be included, and other than that, then it's up to the employees and employers to then work out which best suits their company. But the rights that they have to include are that you have to basically that an employee it can't be penalized for refusing to attend work matters outside of their normal working hours, and then to respect another person's right to disconnect. So that's by not emailing them basically when they're off. And then the other one is that the right of an employee not to have to routinely perform outside their normal working hours. So that seems quite basic, but obviously a lot of people are finding that as a big issue, mainly before the pandemic. But of course, the pandemic has just shone a further light on blurred the lines even between working from home and living at work, basically. But of course, if it doesn't work out with these code of conducts, I suppose that all these companies are meant to be drawing up at the moment. It came into, I think Leo Varadkar signed it in on the 1st of April. So it's something that companies should be working on with their employees at the moment, and it can always be taken to the WRC. So I suppose we'll be able to know whether it's working out. If there's a big backlog in cases in the WRC, we'll know that it's not working out, I suppose. But hopefully we don't see that.
I think that's interesting, because like the right to disconnect that the government have brought in is an example of a quite tangible measure they've taken, and it was part of their national remote work strategy that was published in January. Just on Fidela's point there about the tax allowance, tax relief, like currently it's up to an employer, and they can choose to pay an employee €3.20 per day for remote working, and that's tax free. I think that's really, like, it doesn't really cover the kind of expenses that you might incur working from home. Like in other jurisdictions, I know in Belgium, if you work out the full-time equivalent for a full-time employee working from home, their tax relief is 3 times that. And now I know the government has pledged to look at this in budget 2022, but the pledge is to look at it. So we don't know exactly what form that will take. So I think like budget 2022 will come in October. It's April now. Like if that's going to have a tangible effect, it will need to boost that for employees, because the expenses that we incur working from home, we might not incur going to the office. So that, like, if that's going to be covered, the government needs to definitely increase that.
Yeah, we got a question in there, a comment in there from Cleona, who's asking, will this be enshrined in law? Which kind of touches on what you're saying there, to both of you actually, Sean and Adam. Like if we're talking about the right to disconnect, it's a great thing in theory, but if the way that it's enshrined is that workers have to go to the WRC in order to see it being actioned or being upheld, then that's a real problem. I can't imagine going to the WRC over that, or I think a lot of people would find it hard to imagine going to the WRC over an issue like that, when it's really a workplace issue, like it's really the employer's responsibility rather than putting it onto the employee. So while the government's aims might be noble and practical, it's like the way that it's enforced is going to be the thing that actually matters to all of us. So I suppose kind of when we're talking, Adam, you touched on the right to disconnect there. One thing that does seem to be a big theme at the moment is that a lot of people are feeling quite burnt out, and whether or not that's kind of a part of just working from home, or whether it's working from a pandemic. But could that be a concern? Is that something that it could actually be an issue if lots of us are working from home in future, that we will see these levels of burnout that existed before the pandemic, but could still exist after it as well, or exacerbated by working from home? Oh, you're muted there, Adam. Sorry, that's our second time in conversation.
I thought I was doing so well with unmuting myself, but yeah, I think the right to disconnect, it's hope that might kind of take the burnout side of things out of working from home. But as you mentioned there, it's always been a factor for a lot of people. It's just that the pandemic has just kind of renewed the focus on it. So I think the burnout side of things, yeah, you mentioned there, the enforcement of the right to disconnect would be interesting. But just to go back on that, I think the train of thought by not legislating for the right to disconnect was that it will be very much an in-company thing, where employees and employers, which are supposed to work it out themselves, and then you can raise it with it'll be in future contracts, and you can raise it with your employer that you're not. They're not following the rules that basically that they agree to. But as I say, it'd be interesting to see how it's upheld, and whether there might be need further down the road to legislate for that. But on burnout, I suppose there's an interesting concept that's kind of came up on the back of a New York Times article, and it's on languishing, and it's basically I suppose it's the void between, it's described as the void between depression and, I suppose, flourishing, and the absence of well-being, I suppose, with your mental health. And it's kind of like where you're indifferent to your own indifference. It's hard to be motivated, but you still have the energy to do stuff, which I think a lot of people can relate to. And that's very much, I suppose, a pandemic-induced issue where we're living within the restrictions. So I think Sean mentioned before that the working from home has its issues, but there are issues that are just compacted by the fact that we're living under such strict restrictions. So I think the hope is that people maybe will come out of the languishing phase of things after the pandemic. But one thing to keep in mind is obviously the long-term impact of that, because I think the author of that article mentioned that It's while it's not a mental health issue itself, it's something that can cause maybe further mental health issues further down the road. So I think that's something to watch out for, I suppose, post-pandemic.
Yeah, it says a lot about how much we associate burnout with work nowadays. It just feels like it's just become something that so many people feel. And obviously the pandemic has brought this on for so many of us. And just even the concept of languishing feels like putting a framework onto this feeling that many of us may have, where it's not, a mental health issue. It's not stopping us from getting up and functioning every day, but it's not like we're thriving. It's not like we're doing as well as we would all probably want to be. And Sean, that actually reminds me of something you've said several times during this project, where you've said working from home in a pandemic is very different to working from home in normal times. Can you elaborate a bit on that and kind of talk us through about what the differences might be? Just even as a kind of a light at the end of the tunnel thing, I think for some of us, we might appreciate that kind of sense of what it could look like.
Yeah, it was definitely something that surprised me, and then also really struck with me, where a lot of people I've been speaking to about this, and especially people who've been working from home before the pandemic. And like I know myself, like some of these weeks have been really hard. Like for whatever reason, if the restrictions get on top of you, it's maybe the work that week is just particularly tough or all encompassing. And like I've had bad weeks, I've had bad days, and I think we've all had them. Everyone I'm speaking to has had them, and I've had them a bit more during the pandemic. And I came to associate it in my head with working from home, because if I didn't feel that level of burnt out or similar feelings in work before, why am I feeling it now? It must be because I'm working from home. But a lot of the people that I've spoken to said, no, it definitely could be. That could definitely be a factor in it. But the reason you're feeling like that is because you can't see your friends after work. You probably can't see your family. You can, for a lot of time, we haven't been able to go more than 5 kilometers. You can't go to the cinema. You can't go to the restaurant. You can't go have a pint. All the things that you might like to do in your spare time, a lot of that kind of the social fabric of our being has been kind of stripped away to such a degree. And if all that's left is working, even in a different setting and context, we will associate a lot of the things that are happening with that. So like in my head, then it kind of, like, as you said, a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Like I can imagine, hopefully in a year's time, when I do have the option maybe of going into the office, working from home. I love the office, and I love meeting people. I love the kind of buzz of being around people. It's great. I love it. But then also on a Monday morning, if I have to be in at 6:30 in the morning, maybe I'll just skip the commute, the early commute, and get up and be at my laptop for 6:30. Like I'd say some of the like tangible advantages of remote working, which we can't really see now, I think they will probably and definitely actually become more apparent in the future, hopefully when things go back to a bit more normality.
Yeah, I was reading one piece that was talking about how people might be able to go and work in a friend's house one day a week, or these kind of things, which I hadn't really conceptualized as being options. And suddenly it felt like, oh, there are pathways, there are other ways to work from home that aren't just sitting at the dining room table, every day for 8.5 hours. So I'm really aware that we're talking a lot about offices, but obviously there's huge numbers of people who have never, haven't worked in offices. I'm thinking, emergency services, people working in factories, delivery drivers, like the many people who, kind of work never stopped for them, or work never changed for them. And they may not have the options of the kind of flexibility we're talking about here. But is there any sense that work could change for people in these jobs after the pandemic? That's something that work could be better for them, that conditions could be better for them?
I think that's the hope of a lot of sectors that, well, I suppose in the sectors that firstly have lost a lot of employment due to the restrictions in the pandemic. I suppose, first of all, they'll be hoping that their jobs will return and that the jobs will be there. But I'm sure that, like any industry, they're all hoping that the issues that were there beforehand and that have come to light maybe during the pandemic, that they can be sorted out like further down the line. And I suppose one sector that I've been looking at myself is, I suppose, the gig economy, and specifically within that is the food delivery riders. And when we think of them, maybe before the pandemic, they had their issues and they would be campaigning for them themselves, but maybe wouldn't have got a lot of attention. And then once the pandemic hit, you see how vital they are now to, I suppose, the business models of a lot of restaurants and businesses, particularly in city centres, that don't offer delivery services themselves, but are able to stay open and stay equitable by offering that delivery service. So they are, by playing such a vital part, you'd think that maybe there would be some movement on I suppose, improvement in their job prospects at the moment. But a lot of the writers have started to join trade unions, so the likes of SIP2 and Unite. And I suppose they're campaigning in the hopes that they'd get improvements on either job security, their rate of pay, or even their safety, which I know safety is a big issue. That's got a lot of media attention in the last while, particularly over the summer. There's a good few incidents there for Deliveroo drivers, I should say. So I think the pandemic has just made it harder to ignore these issues, and they're starting to unionize. I think the hope is that they will see some change further down the line. So, and it'd be interesting to see what other sectors like the likes of hospitality do when we're coming out of this, to see how they improve their own conditions.
Yeah, because it feels like people have been kind of pushed towards gig economy jobs or portfolio careers so much in recent years, and the lack of benefits or the lack of support has kind of been packaged somehow as being kind of like it makes it more appealing in some ways. But now we realize that without those supports, those jobs can just fall through the cracks and become so much more difficult for people. So what actually kind of supports will they need? What changes will they need? That, you know, we're not seeing at the moment.
Just on the gig economy, because it does encompass a lot of people that maybe, particularly from the pandemic, who lost their full-time jobs. It's allowed a lot more people to come in. So you could even be a graphic designer and be considered to be, I suppose, in a platform industry once you're on an app-based or website-based business. But the EU launched a public consultation on the rights of platform workers earlier this year, and they invited trade unions and employer organisations to find an agreement on legislation for, I suppose, EU-wide legislation. And if they can't come to an agreement, then the Commission is going to drop legislation by the end of this year. So I'm sure that will have plenty of implications, not just for delivery drivers, but for people working in that kind of gig economy in Ireland. So that would be interesting to watch by the end of the year, because there's not one catch-all solution for all those industries, and even for delivery riders themselves. There's a very varied opinion definitely among them. So I think they'd be hoping that they could find a solution before that kind of the EU has its say, basically.
Sean, just to jump away from employees and move more towards employers, one of the pieces you're working on at the moment is about managers. And you spoke to one manager who spoke about how there's many bosses who were just not prepared for this pandemic, and it was really clear very quickly. And I think the pandemic really helped highlight the differences between good and bad bosses, because if you have a bad boss, it's magnified so many times when you're working from home. You know, if there's bad communication skills or bad leadership or whatever it is, suddenly that, you know, it's always going to have a bearing, but it has more of a bearing when you're working from home. Can you talk about the impact that this kind of bad managing or good managing can have on employees, and just the kind of problems that employees may face when they're working from home?
Yeah, I think one of the big things going forward will be progression, because like this was a shock. We all, like, so many people went to working from home, and that's that. But then when you come to a situation where there could be some people in the office and some people working from home, I think it's something employees are going to be concerned about, and that managers are going to have to be very aware of, is progression. Like a lot of people I spoke to said there could be that sense of bias, recency bias. The person you've seen in the office yesterday working so hard, working till 7 o'clock, the person who works till that time every evening because they're really committed to getting the job done. That could stick in managers' head that, okay, that person's working really hard. They probably deserve that chance of career progression or a promotion. Whereas the person who's at home because of family reasons or whatever other reasons, they're getting up, they're going to work at 9, they're doing their job till 5, and they're doing all of the same amount of work to the same standard. Like there's kind of that sense of out of sight, out of mind. If you only see that person on a Zoom call, you don't get a full sense of the work or commitment that they're putting in. Whereas the person who may not be suited for the progression, but is in there 24/7, essentially would be prioritized for that. I think there's that sense of a worry that managers could fall victim to that. And I think it's easier to do so for managers at a time when their employees are literally at home. I think that's a big thing. One thing that has really struck me as well that managers will definitely need to adapt to is how you handle new hires and how you handle interns who are starting off at the company. Because even with us, like I've been astounded by how well the people we've had starting with us that I've never met because we've been out of the office for so long, I've been astounded by how well they've adapted to it. But like from my own experience, I remember for like this job, any job I've been in, your first few days, you sit down at your desk, you have someone more senior next to you showing you the ropes, and kind of getting you into the social aspect of the job as well, that kind of banter we like. And you learn the ropes. That's been like the jobs since the beginning of time. Essentially, you have to learn the ropes. You have to learn how to do things. But for those new hires now, they're not going to meet their colleagues. They probably even did their job interviews over Zoom, and they're going to be starting a new job. So it's something that managers will need to be really aware of. They'll need to show just, I think, a really good degree of empathy towards their new colleagues, just to kind of understand them as people, ingratiate them into the team in the right way, and just make sure that like these new hires, they develop, they learn the right skills, and also have that social aspect as well. So they're two things I think are going to be really important for managers.
You talk about that social aspect, Sean. I'm kind of interested in that to hear what both of you think about that. Do you think there's a sense that work will become more transactional? That because managers can't really judge people based on things like, say, presenteeism or whatever, just somebody turning up or being nice or them liking somebody, they may have to judge people based more on the output that they actually produce in their work every day. Like, do you think that work will become a place, or become more of a place, where it's just about the work that you do rather than the people that do the work?
I think there's a chance of that for sure, but I do think the best companies will still try and find the right balance between, okay, here's your job, let's get it done, and also those kind of supports and that social aspect, because like we spend so much of our lives in work. Like in my personal experience anyway, I felt like I've gotten more from work when I have these extra aspects, this career progression. If I'm feeling like I'm progressing in my career, I'm happier in my job. If I have that social aspect in the job where you might go for lunch or might go for a pint after work, I feel like I get more from my job then, as well as doing the actual work itself. Like I feel like this could happen, but I would rather it didn't.
I think that's sometimes been viewed with kind of a sense of cynicism, where we see kind of the Google example, which is probably the most extreme, where it's not even that the boundary between work and life is blurred, it's that the line has probably been erased, where you can work in Google, go to the gym, get your food from Google, do your life almost becomes revolving around work. And I think that had already been seen as a not great thing. So maybe that's kind of an example of something that we're going to see less of, after the pandemic, where people are less willing to be able to blur their life so much with where they work.
Yeah, I do think that's important. It's really about finding the right balance, and maybe not skew towards like too far one way or too far for another. Obviously, people have preferences, but just my own personal would just find that right balance between working and then also the other aspects that you find beneficial.
Yeah. What do both of you think is going to happen with city centres? I'm thinking particularly, say, of like Dublin, Cork, Galway, Belfast. But if we're going, do you think we're going to see workplaces move away from being located in city centres now that they don't necessarily need to be located there because their employees may not be there? And also, what kind of challenges do you think they'll face trying to attract people to come into city centres if people don't need to be there for their jobs as a result? Like, are you concerned about Dublin city centre?
I don't know about concerned. I'd be hopeful that they'd be able to sort out the issues that have been so evident over the last year. The first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is public toilets. It's big on the public consciousness now. Basically, if you're in town and you need to use a toilet, there's maybe two. I think there's two in the city centre, and then there's maybe two more a bit further out. But just the likes of that, it's I can imagine that a lot of office buildings will be left idle after a while, and the city has more so become a meetup spot. So I think if the council was to take that approach towards the city, to welcome people in, to have the amenities there for people to use within the city, where it's not just the economy of the city centre isn't relying on people working there to then spend money in the shops. Like if the town is a welcoming place, then you'll get people coming in. So I think that's what we'd like to see. But a year into the pandemic, we still only have 2 toilets in Dublin. It's
not great. Yeah, Dublin city centre never feels very welcoming, really.
No, definitely not.
Like it doesn't feel like there's places to just hang around or wait. Like there's even so few benches or places to sit. Sean, sorry, you were going to speak there?
Yeah, like I would actually be quite concerned, because like when you think about like what we've had to do during the pandemic, like we used to go to the office and work for a day in the city and then we'd go home. We don't do that anymore because we can't work from home. We would go to the city to go shopping in the shopping centre, but we don't have to do that anymore because like so many people, because the shops have been closed for so long, loads of people shop online. And then what happens to like, it feels like a kind of delicate ecosystem where like so many businesses in and around the city centre rely on people to be in them. Now, we know that like tourism, overseas tourism especially, is not going to be back for probably a long time. And if office workers don't go back to the cities as well, you think of the small little cafes, you think of the other the delis, the places that rely on office workers, and you kind of get a bit worried. Are we going to see maybe empty cities, which would really worry me, because I think the problem then for like policymakers, for government, for the council, it becomes then, how do we get the people who already live in and around cities back in? And obviously Adam mentioned toilets, which are so basic. They should really, really address that. It's about pedestrianising streets. It's about making outdoor dining facilities. It's about making the city attractive for us to be in, even if we don't work in it anymore. And I think that it's a massive challenge. And I know like cities around the country are working on that. And I really hope to get a grip. I mean, like, the only silver bullet I could think of maybe would be a whitewater rafting centre. But apart from that, I can't think of anything else.
That's brilliant, Sean. I feel like you should pitch that to Dublin City. I don't know if it's been done yet, but I mean,
they might like the idea. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, it seems like, how else would you attract people in? But I think that's really interesting, because something we've talked about in the newsroom is about how house prices in Dublin are actually rocketing, like going like that at the moment, going up by like say 40 or 50,000 in the space of weeks, which indicates that there are people aren't leaving Dublin necessarily. We're not quite seeing the evidence of that, but they're planning for their future in, say, Dublin suburbs, and they're planning to stay in Dublin, but perhaps work from home more. So as you say, how do you incentivize these people to visit Dublin city centre if the reasoning isn't there for them anymore? And if we don't have toilets, and if we don't have, benches or places for them to actually assemble or do things in the city centre, then it's a really tough challenge. So we've got a question in from a reader, and they say, do you think, will there be the option in the future to work from everywhere, say in Europe, and then being taxed at the same time as being taxed in Ireland? So could you work for an Irish company and pay Irish taxes, but live in, say, Slovenia or Paris, or, the place where you've always wanted to live? Do you see that happening? Do you see Irish people like moving outside of the country?
I think there are definitely limits on that at present. So you can't just up sticks right now and move and still pay taxes in Ireland. I don't like that. That's not possible at the minute, at least not for an indefinite period. I think it's a really tricky one, because it would require like negotiations and agreements at a European level for a person to say, for like the Polish government to say, okay, we're going to allow Irish workers to live and work here and pay tax in Ireland. Like, I think it'd be very hard to convince that jurisdiction that that's okay if they're using the amenities of that country. I think it's like there could be some flexibility there in future, but like I think that's something that like will be way down the line. And in terms of government's remote work strategy, that doesn't get an appearance in there. So like I would like the idea of being able to go to Spain in the winter and work from home there and not have the Irish winter. But like it's.
I mean, you're laughing, but I saw Bermuda and Barbados and a number of other islands, particularly in the Caribbean, have changed their visa requirements to allow people to come and live there to work if they choose to. So I'm just saying, if people haven't considered Barbados as a lifestyle, maybe now is the time. Maybe that's more appealing than going to. How
much are Tourism Barbados paying you for this? Are we sharing the money afterwards?
Yeah, hashtag SponCon. We've got a comment in from Miriam who says, this is called the donut effect. People live around the city and the offices close. People live around the city and offices close. The economy dies within the city. If we convert some of the empty office spaces to condos and address affordable housing issues, that could be a solution. And I think there's something in that sense of, how many people actually live in the city centre. It's never quite been seen as, there are some residential areas. I'm thinking of kind of, around like York Street and parts of like the North Inner City in particular. But it could be a solution, address affordable housing issues by using the empty shops, the empty spaces in town.
I think that's so important, because like we could walk through this. Like I've been in the city a few times recently, and I was just really struck by like all these empty, closed places, and you're like, will that place open again? Will that place open again? And I think like we've been all banging on about the affordability of housing and how bad it's been for like half a decade now, longer. And I think if you address that, you address so many problems in society in general if you create more affordable housing. And like it would take some brave policy making to really go in and take those empty office spaces to convert them to housing. But I think if you do that, you'd not only address partly address the problem of these empty cities, but you address so many things as well. Like I would love to see that, but then the government in successive years doesn't seem to have gotten a handle on this yet. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see if we see these big, ambitious ideas being put forward now during the pandemic, or when it's all over, and when is the time for these plans to actually get made and to be seen to be like followed through. Sean, so far on the Good Information Project, on this side of things, you've been looking at things like the future of offices, how managers will do their job after the pandemic, what the government's going to do to encourage remote working. What are you working on at the moment, and what can you talk about that is coming up as part of the Good Information Project?
Yeah, so over the next few weeks on the journal, we'll be publishing articles on like trying to cover as many angles as possible in like the future of remote work. Like I've really enjoyed the last week or so because I've been speaking to a really diverse range of voices to get like their specific take on what work might look like for them in future. So I've been talking to parents who are like making those decisions around how to source childcare while working from home and what form that takes. I've been talking to people who are living with disabilities and how remote work might offer some good opportunities for them, but it needs to be followed through with a lot of other decisions and supports. So that's been quite interesting. And then what Adam was talking about earlier on, then the people for whom work like hasn't changed during COVID, people who are still in the front line, and then people who've been kind of made unemployed by this as well. So the way work will look like for them in future will all be different. So I think it's important to try and get those voices in. As well as that, we'll be looking at some of the kind of big ideas around the future of work and why COVID may actually create a fertile ground to try and test these. Like I'm sure people have heard of them before, things like a 4-day work week, which I know that unions are a big fan of here and have been pushing. Things like universal basic income, which the government Minister for Arts and many other things, Catherine Martin, is considering for the arts industry and for musicians as well, universal basic income, and seeing how that works. And also like thanks so much for everyone for joining us today. We want to hear from you. Like we want to hear what your working week has looked like. How do you think it'll look like in future? What's your setup like? I know the coordinator behind the project, Brian, he's really keen to see what kind of backdrops you have on your Zoom calls. So we'd love to hear from you as well, and like just to kind of understand what your priorities are going forward as well when it comes to work.
Yeah. In true journalism style, I'm very aware that we have gone past our deadline or our aim of 30 minutes. So I think it's probably time to kind of wrap this up. Yeah, who knew journalists are bad with timekeeping? I kind of like to, for my final question or final thing I'm interested in is like, I'd like to know what both of you what do both of you predict the working life is going to look like in Ireland in say a year's time or 2 years' time? What things do you think will be different? Like what do you think realistically things are going to look like?
Do you want to go first then, or I'll
go? You'd probably have a more better answer. I'd probably be more hopeful in my outlook, in that I'd hope that the people that want to work from home can, and that there's not a push to go back to the office if you're not ready to. I think that's an important thing, because there is a kind of, we all have that urge to get back to some symbol of normal, I suppose. But a lot of people have been, I suppose, thriving among, I suppose, all the chaos of the pandemic. Like Sean mentioned, the remote working hubs, like it'd be great to see more of those popping up around the country. For another project we're working on for the Good Info project, I've been chatting to a few people that have relocated, I suppose, out of the city centres, and I've found I suppose a better way of living for them, in that they have a better work-life balance. So I think overall that's one thing that you'd hope that a lot of people would have, that maybe the right to disconnect and more remote working hubs and more options, I suppose, that would probably improve and change the work culture that we have.
More options.
I think one thing that'll be super interesting going forward is we know around half of people had their work situation changed by COVID, but like the other half didn't. And if we go to a situation where like we're like predominantly office-based workers, and if people like us start to get that option of working a few days at home and working a few days in the office, we start to get that flexibility. I'd wonder what would happen to industries where that flexibility kind of isn't possible. Like one that comes to mind there is the hospitality industry, who've been awfully decimated during all of this. And I remember I'm the Journal's part-time pub correspondent, and I would go in and speak to publicans and pub owners to kind of understand their issues. And I have done that a few times over the course of the last year. And it struck me that a few of them said that all their workers, while they're on the PUP waiting to come back to work, they're kind of saying, we might actually go into different industries. So if there's a whole swathe of workers who can get offered that flexibility and that kind of new way of working that creates that work-life balance that Adam mentioned, if they can get that, but there are other jobs that can't quite offer that. I think that's going to create a huge disparity, and I think it might have a negative effect on some industries that will find it hard to retain people. Now, I know that's quite a negative spin on it, but I think there's a lot of questions to be asked, and I think there's a lot of supports that will need to be given to those industries in particular in the future.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about there being kind of a K-shaped recovery for the economy after the pandemic, where some people who kept their jobs and were able to work from home, they are fine, they got like that. But for people who say lost their jobs or lost income, lost the places where they live, their recovery is like that, and it kind of it created a kind of even more of a two-tier society. And there could be that sense in terms of some people have the cushier jobs or easier jobs, more flexible jobs, and then people who don't have those options just think, well, why would I not work in an area where I could have those options, which is really difficult. We got one final comment there from Rebecca saying that remote working hubs in the suburbs could keep traffic out of the city centre, could allow people to afford more reasonably priced homes outside of the city, while also providing an environment for workers to thrive, which I think is such an interesting kind of part of the conversation at the moment. This idea that working from home doesn't need to mean, remote working doesn't need to mean working from your home. It could be a hub. It could be, people from the same area all working together. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to say thank you so much to Adam Daly and Sean Murray, my colleagues, for just a really thought-provoking and really great ideas here. It's been really good to talk to you both. And thanks to everybody who's watched today. And we really appreciate you spending your lunch hour or your 40 minutes, 50 minutes with us today. And as Sean said, we really do want to hear from you and about your thoughts on this. If there's anything that you want to share with us, please do get in touch. If it's a photo of your workstation, if it's a sentence, if it's a paragraph, if it's an essay, whatever it is, give us a shout and we will use it to try and kickstart some ideas for the conversation that we're having about the future of work. So you can email us. You can email, actually, I'll give Sean's address. You can email Sean@thejournal.ie or Adam@thejournal.ie or me, Christine@thejournal.ie with your thoughts or your ideas. You can go to the site and sign up for our newsletter. We also have a Facebook group for the Good Information Project, which you can join on Facebook. Basically, if you just search for the Good Information Project on the Journal, you'll see all the ways you can get in touch, from carrier pigeon to smoke signal, whatever it looks like. Maybe not those. Maybe. So thank you all very much for being here today, and we'll see you again. Thank you.